So in our other column, what we want to do is actually go and list my projects. So what we can do for that is we're going to go ahead and set up a function. So let's go ahead and put this in its own function. We'll do search GitHub, and I'm going to take all of this code and put it into search GitHub. Let's go ahead and clean that. Okay, and so instead of firing this event, we're actually going to go ahead and fire search GitHub. So now when we click on search, this function will run. And I want to go ahead and create a new function, which is get repositories. And we want to use a name to go ahead and do that. And what we're going to end up being able to do if we go back into our GitHub documentation, if we go to GitHub API, repositories, list a user's repositories, we want to call users/colinloretz/repos. So we can come in here and do our get JSON again. And this URL is going to be the same. We're just going to add repos to the end, and we're going to finish off our function. So let's go ahead and output the data that we get back from this. And we need to actually call this. So get repository's name. So what happens here is that this function gets called if it was successful. So we want to call get repositories, and we want to pass in this name to search. And that will take Colin Loretz and place it into this function. Right now we're searching for my name, but we're actually going to replace this name with name and this name here with name to search in just a second. So let's go ahead and close out the docs, refresh the page, pull up our console, hit search. So here you see the data about myself, but then you also see this array down here. And it's an array full of objects. So if we open this up, you'll see object 0. And there's a whole bunch of information in here. So this is the information for each of the GitHub projects that I have public on my page. So what we want to do with this is loop over the array of objects and potentially either append them to a list or create divs. However you want to display those projects, we can do that there. So let's go ahead and find that other column. So this column is empty right now. And let's go ahead and create a unordered list called projects, so we have an ID of projects. And what we're going to do is create a variable called repositories. And repositories is going to be equal to this data function. So we could just use data, but repository is going to be a little bit more of an obvious name for it. We can also just replace this here. And so now repositories is the variable. And what I'm going to do is create a loop. So far we've always done a for loop, which you absolutely can do. You can do for var I equals 0, I is less than repositories dot length, I plus plus, and then do your work here. However, I'm going to write this a little bit differently. This is a nice feature of JavaScript where you can actually do dot for each. And so what this is going to do is say for each of the objects in repositories, we're going to do a thing. And so for each of those, run this function, and the function actually takes in the single object that we're currently looking at. And so if we have 10 objects, this is going to run 10 times. And each time it runs, repository will be equal to that repository that we're on. This is really nice because you don't have to deal with repositories index of I dot something and so forth. So this will just allow us to have a cleaner syntax, which we'll look at in just a second here. So let's just output these to our list. So projects is our UL list. So if we look at our index page, we have this UL list. and we're going to append, which will add a new child of whatever we add in between these quotes to that element. So I'm going to create a list item, and in between the quotes I'm going to go ahead and say repository.name. And if we refresh the page over here, search for myself, we should get our details from our profile and a list of projects. So we can go a little bit further. We can make all of these into links. So let's go ahead and do that. And what we're going to end up doing is creating a link, and we want to use the repository's URL, which is inside of this object. So we can go ahead and say that we need to splice in another variable, do repository.html URL, and now these should be live links. If we click on airport codes, we will go to the airport codes project. But you'll notice that if we search HMU design, we still get Colin Loretz, and we also keep appending to this list. So it's not resetting the list, it's just adding to it forever. So what we need to do is we need to hook up our input box to our search, and we also need to clear out this list every time we add a search. So let's go ahead and do that. So under search GitHub, we have the name to search as a variable. So we can just chop off my name here and add name to search. So now this will use that name that we've entered. Go ahead and get rid of our console log there. And then that name to search will also get passed into this function, where in the new function it will be called name. So we're actually going to have to come in the center here and concatenate these together. So now whatever name was passed in will get called here. So let's go ahead and refresh this and see that in action. So there's myself. Let's try HMU design. And there you go. So Chris swapped out. But now you'll see my projects and his projects have shown up here. So let's go ahead and see what we can do there. So when this function gets called, we end up actually appending no matter what. And we actually want to clear out the project's UL before we start adding things to it. So let's go ahead and just say .empty, and this will take this element, so projects, and it will empty its entire inner children, all of the children that it has, whether they're LIs or if you're in a div, whatever it might be, it will get rid of those items so that you just have an empty projects element. So now let's do Colin Loretz. And now you see that we have our projects over here. Search for HMU design. Now my projects went away and his have been replaced. You can click on his link, takes you to his profile. If we go to mine, click on mine, and it'll take me to my profile. So that is pretty much the gist of interacting with APIs through jQuery. You will want to keep in mind that if you're using an API that has a secret, so typically something like that would look like this, where I have http api.github.com/users/username/repos, you often will have either an API key that goes in here or some other way of authenticating with the service. And what's really important about this is that if you're going to use jQuery in production and deploy an API application such as this, if you go and look in the code, so let's go ahead and open our JavaScript, you will be able to see those codes and API tokens inside of your code. Any companies that have APIs that are designed for jQuery have ways around this, so definitely read the documentation. It's very important to understand how to interact with a API. If you're dealing with an API that has a lot of secret credentials, logins, authentications, we're typically going to end up actually doing that on the back end, which we'll end up doing starting next week when we get into Introduction to Ruby. So just some heads up, but always read the docs. The documentation can always help you. Go ahead and try to build this and customize it, clean it up. Mine doesn't look great, but if you spend some extra time on it, set the Bootstrap up properly, set up the CSS properly, and you'll be good to go.